is a toxic depressant that literally rots your brain, literally makes you act out in violence on the street, is the reason why women feel like they are abused by their partners. Obviously a horrible thing. Affirmative wins this debate in a couple of ways. Firstly, and most clearly, we will prove why people just consume alcohol less, but also in better ways. Secondly, why there'll just be less backlash for this. Thirdly, why regulation is insufficient. But importantly, we will prove that this is not the only way to solve these issues. It is the best way, because not only do we get all these benefits of drinking less alcohol and things like that, but uniquely, the government just benefits by getting more money, by also getting money that funnels directly into things like regulation, directly into things like healthcare and alcohol, like treatment and prevention. First of all, on setup. First of all, what does this look like? We think it just looks like the government has a monopoly over production, retailing, and advertising of alcoholic products. I'll note here, this has worked successfully in Nordic countries and most of Canada, apart from Alberta. Secondly, we think part of the money would likely go into healthcare, go into alcoholic treatment and things like that. Obviously, this would probably be the case because there's a huge health crisis that has occurred as a result of alcohol, but also just like there is a huge relationship between violence and alcohol. For example, a lot of domestic violence cases or assault on the street and calls and things like that are a result of alcohol. So because right now the cost to do things like regulation or to do any of those things costs so much. It costs less to be proactive about these sort of things instead of reactive, but also just politically popular that like healthcare and things would happen because the government has such a high burden to stand for the well-being of people. Onto arguments. Firstly, why would people just consume alcohol in better ways? I think the first thing, which is very easy to prove beside affirmative, is that people just generally will consume less alcohol. First of all, it's just because it would cost higher, because government has a active disincentive to push on people because they want to minimize that social risk of domestic violence cases happening or street brawls happening and things like that. Similar to what they've done with like increasing taxes or sin taxes or things like that. So this is to say that people probably won't do or just do less of expensive things, means that they'll consume less alcohol, means when they go to the pub, they'll drink 2 drinks instead of 5. But also, government understands this is a highly profitable industry. Australia drinks a lot of alcohol. Obviously, the state will want to profit out of this. And this is really important, right? Because it means that our benefits about prevention tactics and healthcare and things go massively up at the point at which this is a profitable industry. Also, it just means that it's that these sort of things, these sort of treatment and prevention strategies are more accessible and better because the government will also funnel this into better resources and good ads and things like that. Third of all, we think that like the reason why people continue to drink alcohol and things like that is because they don't self-identify the problem that they have, because it's not financially burdensome for them, or because it's hard to access like help or resources and things like that, just because there is less of them. At the point where it's more accessible to reach those resources, to see all the advertising that governments would do all this, it is more accessible than that of the addictive substance. They're less likely to consume this addictive substances. The second part is argument proof, why the state is not as profit driven as like private alcohol companies in malicious ways, because the whole marketing like mission of private alcohol companies is for you to get more addicted, because if you get more addicted, then they're going to make more money, right? So this looks like putting out pernicious ads being like, oh, you have to like drink in order to be social and things like that. It's a reason why, like, for example, even despite regulations or despite social backlash, things like hard solo and stuff have to get like renamed and stuff, despite still being able to sell them for profit. But also I'll just note here that the average person is probably not super addicted. Maybe they drink socially, but they have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. So at this point, it just means that if we prove to you that they are more educated and have better access to help, but less access to alcohol, they're more likely to drink less. Also, I would just note that governments control these would have greater control of these narratives. That is a benefit in itself, but they're also likely to control it in more positive ways. For example, having more positive advertising, having more stuff on like packaging and things like that to assess like the risk of alcohol. But also, even at a retailing standpoint, they'll probably have better checks and balances. For example, looking like cracking down more on like underage drinking and things like that. That is also a benefit in itself. But also, when governments endorse that it's kind of not this edgy thing anymore, because like the government is like this legitimate body, there is probably less incentive for people to abuse this in bad ways, because it's not seen as a sort of edgy like subculture, sort of a counterculture sort of thing. But the last thing I'll add here is that governments are more likely to be transparent. The state is attuned to the local needs of its populace. They have an obligation to uphold welfare. People are likely to interact with that in positive ways, and the government knows that they should do that to construct these narratives in positive ways, because it compounds the sort of stuff that they're doing. This reinforces existing narratives around sort of healthier drinking norms. Like, for example, there is just a growing trend of people being more sober curious, especially amongst young adults. But also it just supplements narratives like you don't need to get drunk in order to have a good time, at the point at which the government nationalizes the alcohol industry. These narratives become more legitimate and more people are likely to follow them. This is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, less people consume stuff that literally rots your brain, it makes you be addicted. That is a huge benefit for a huge amount of people, and everyone who takes less drinks. But secondly, you're less likely to be happier. You're not consuming this depressant. You're less hungover. You contribute more to society. You feel more productive. That's good for the government. But also, you're more likely to find healthier alternatives. For example, doing things like exercise, doing things like having non-alcoholic drinks instead. And the third impact, which is very important, is that there's probably less alcohol-induced violence. So, for example, like alcohol-induced domestic violence or assault, that just means people feel safe, less people get hurt in particularly malicious ways. That is, that's the first argument. Secondly, why there won't be as much backlash as the opposition suggests. A couple reasons for this. Firstly, people obviously can still drink from outside of the house. Maybe it's a bit expensive, but ultimately we've proven that expense is a good thing because that money will directly go into helping like the addicts or the most vulnerable that they want to target. But secondly, there are also just countervailing trends, which I explained. For example, like the sober curious movement, or the fact that like Dan Murphy's now has like multiple like non-alcoholic brands stocked up in stores. But thirdly, the reason that we don't fund or regulate heavily right now is because the average taxpayer doesn't want to pay for addicts. They don't feel like it's their fault, and they don't feel like they want to push for this sort of stuff. But at the point at which this money comes from the people themselves purchasing their own alcohol, and that money is going directly into funding their own systems, that is when it becomes actually really politically palatable, and people are likely to support something like that. It reinforces current narratives about health and things like that. So there's unlikely to be that backlash there. It actually takes away that problem because people are like, oh, the addicts themselves are like helping themselves. That's a good thing. But even if there is some backlash, the social benefits of consuming less alcohol and it probably greatly outweigh that minimal backlash. But also, I just think it is pretty socially palatable that people like healthcare, that people like having less addicts on the street and having less violence. Secondly, I think you also just unlock new voters. You probably unlock like these new like sober curious voters or like religious voters. They probably are attuned to this sort of things. But thirdly, you probably just have more dialogue with the government. The average person probably thinks that they can change the government, but they will never interact with these private alcohol companies. So that is to say that there is probably more political will to be more anti-alcohol, more funding for like treatment and things like that. So we've proven that it's probably socially palatable, and we shift the motivation of the people who used to be against that funding and things like that. Finally, why regulation is insufficient. I think first of all, private alcohol companies skirt regulations all the time. For example, if they have to reduce the alcohol content or whatever, reduce consumption, they're just going to like reduce the like alcohol percentage of their drink. People obviously don't notice these things. They also do this in very like blatant ways, like with hard solo, they always get around it. There's also just probably a regulatory lag between companies moving faster than government regulators. At the end of the day, it's not our burden to prove that this is the only solution. We provide you a number of benefits, extrinsic to the ones about drinking less alcohol. Government gets more money. That more money helps the actual problem, helps the most vulnerable.
Thank you so much for that speech, and I'd like to welcome up the first negative speaker.
What we're going to prove is that the government is going to cut prices in the name of more politically popular things like tax cuts, when in reality they are able to hack revenue out of people's wallets and trap alcoholic people into eternal spirals of alcoholism. So we totally agree about, like you just said about nationalization. We think that like the government, as it comes into this ton of stuff, right? So all the fields to grow, like things like grapes, things like labs, manufacturers, all of that, they are going to need to show that this was worth it, and they're going to need to prove why this was a worthy like seizure. So we're going to talk about firstly how governments are going to drop prices, which then turns people's drinking habits way worse. So firstly, this changes the government's incentive when it comes to approaching alcohol, because the amount that they can tax alcohol in the status quo is limited because they don't get all of that in revenue, right? And so once the government becomes the only distributor of alcohol, it becomes an enormous stream of government revenue, right? We understand this because lots and lots of people drink casually. Probably, some people drink not that casually. Some people spend upwards of 5 to 10% of their income on something like alcohol, and it's probably a lot more than we would even know because a lot of people do it in secret and they do their best to hide that. We think that alcohol also has like a major place in our culture. We understand that, like it's a mainstay of functionally every type of social gathering, to the extent that asking people to like not be drunk at your wedding can sometimes cause a massive hissy fit. We think that the government, therefore, once they're the only distributor, they have the ability to make the manufacturing price very low. This is, if they're seizing all the manufacturers and they've got like, actually, I have some stuff on this later, but then they ability to make the manufacturing price low. They have economies of scale in the manufacturing because they have a monopoly on it now. This means if they can set the manufacturing price low, they can also set the price low because they are getting 100% of this revenue ultimately, right? And this is why it becomes a massive source of government income. As a result of this, we're going to prove that more people are going to binge drink, more people are going to become alcoholics, and that therefore all of the harms of alcohol that Affirmative gives you that we agree with are so much worse under their side. So governments, we think, and this is like a big part of it, right? Governments want to be re-elected. They want to do things that are politically popular. That means they aren't going to put a lot of their revenue into things like rehab, because people are really selfish, and people don't like their dollars going to the people who they perceive to be undeserving of those dollars. And addicts are like the absolute epitome of this, right? People see addiction as a self-inflicted choice that you made because you had poor self-control. People see sobriety as something that you can easily opt into and opt out of, as though addiction is not a very serious disease. We think this is especially true of the people who likely have the most social and political capital in this case, like really rich people who have the most voice, because they are probably least likely to have the empathy for those poor and needy addicts, because they see those people as literally the scourge of society. Therefore, we don't think that this money is going to be going in those places. What we think is going to happen is the government is going to instead pivot to give people things that they want. The government knows that optically this is not going to look very good if they just drop all the prices. It's going to look like they are, aiding and abetting addiction. We understand that. So the government is going to need things to convince the people that this was a good decision. That's going to look like things that win them votes. That's going to look like things like tax cuts, things like programs that benefit the wealthy, that tell them, it's okay. We're putting this money into good use, and they can do things like that, right? Tax cuts and programs are now totally in the government's. The government now has a total capacity to do this, because the revenue, they can make it up with the massive sales of alcohol that remain that high even when the prices are dropped, right? And this means that they have a much lower incentive now to minimize drinking and to warn people of those harms, because they understand that the more revenue they can make from alcohol, the more they can provide people with things that are politically palatable, that are politically preferable, that give them votes, that keep them in power. And we believe that is absolutely the number one thing that they would like in this scenario. So, on to the second point. First, this just basically means that all of the harms that they've already expressed are just much worse on their side, because the government now has a much lower incentive to really to minimize drinking and to curb drinking. We think that it's probable that they would do things like get more cops to monitor for drink driving, because they understand it's pretty bad if drink driving suddenly skyrockets. But they're probably not actually going to necessarily curb the way that people drink, because they recognize now it's a major source of revenue because they make that revenue. But now on why the government has the financial incentive to have a very small range of drinks available, and why this worsens alcoholism and changes the culture surrounding drinking. Because we talked very briefly about the economy of scale manufacturing, And when we talk about that, it's the fact that the government has the monopoly on these manufacturers. They have the monopoly on all of this, which means there is also no competition and no incentive to diversify, because it's not like your audience or customers are going to be able to go anywhere else. That's literally what monopoly means. That means that they have a very low incentive to actually have nice, good quality drinks. We want to know, this is really important to note, that this happens gradually. This is going to be a slow descent into worse and worse quality drinks that people are forced to accept, because we know this will probably in the end be not very popular if it happens suddenly. But it won't happen suddenly, because the government is going to realize that they can make whatever they want and people will buy it so that they can drink, which makes drinking alcohol no longer classy, no longer something that's done for taste or for a social gathering. It's something that you do to get drunk. You drink to get drunk, right? And so people's reason to drink alcohol changes. They're no longer drinking because it's enjoyable or because it is a social event, like something, like a wedding, for example. Sorry for example. They're drinking to get trashed, and that also has benefits for them, because they now also, if the alcohol tastes like shit, it also, you get so hammered you can't even taste it that bad, right? We think that this is going to lead to binge drinking in a number of ways, because now people have access to a lot of alcohol that's going to get them absolutely smashed, and they're going to start to fall into those patterns of addiction that we recognize are extremely harmful for so many members of the community, that Affirmative agrees are harmful for the members of the community, right? And so when we take a look at the material in this speech, we see a few things. The government is able to cut prices because they now understand that they have a monopoly on the manufacturing, and that they are able to do functionally whatever they like with the production and the sale of alcohol in this country, right? And that is extremely bad, because we don't believe that the government has good intentions in this case. We think that if their primary incentive is to be re-elected, then they have reason to do things which will harm people, even to a small margin, because people will absolutely that's the way up for them, right? That people will accept this because they understand that this government has done lots of good things. And we think that this is a really major part of the debate. And we think that, that's all. Fascinating.
The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is talk about at the point at which alcohol is, the production and sale of alcohol is nationalised, what then does the industry look like? Because I think this negative team brings out an incredibly unintuitive characterization of what the government is likely to do with this industry that is incredibly hard to buy, but also just totally unresponsive to all of our material as to why governments are likely to do this well. We actually preempt the snake push and explain, we don't just sell it, so what does it have to say about our model, which is just that the government is going to do this responsibly, because alcohol is the source of a series of public health crises that are super, super expensive and generally make people kind of happier. They tell you that people don't want rehab. It's super poorly unpopular to help addicts because people see them as a scourge to the earth. But we actually preempt this snake push and explain that the reason why under the status quo people don't want the government to spend money on rehab programs is that the average taxpayer views it as deeply unfair that they, as a person who is not addicted to something, has to fund the addiction of someone else. At the point at which you nationalise the sale of alcohol, addicts who are spending their money on these substances just become the people bearing the cost of rehabilitation for those substances if that thing is directly reinvested, which really gets rid of that electoral incentive. We think this is quite intuitive. So then, what does Next tell us about their characterization of how the government is going to do this? They tell you that people are essentially going to trap people into alcoholism, and that the government is going to drop prices really extensively and force people to be addicts. The first thing they're going to do is just sense check this argument. We actually gave you some examples of countries where this policy exists, And those governments just have not done this. In fact, they have done the opposite and have raised prices of alcohol as to reduce consumption. Like, I don't think Sweden is seen as like a bastion of alcoholism and depravity. But the second thing to say is that alcoholism is a super expensive thing. The vast majority of violent crime and domestic violence is fueled by alcohol. That costs the state billions of dollars every year. The vast majority of health issues that people face in their lives are exacerbated and accelerated by, if not caused by, alcohol. That places a massive strain on the public health system. People also make really stupid choices when they drink and oftentimes wind up in prison. This is necessarily a massive problem. Addiction is also a reason why people wind up in poverty and wind up needing to access state support because you spend so much money on alcohol. So we tell you that like making people more into like bigger alcoholics is a really stupid decision for the government economically because they necessarily have to spend more money on programs helping people deal with that. We give you far more intuitive material as to why being proactive in establishing rehab is just far better policy. The second response that I have to is that governments care about people. Generally when you go into politics, it's not to like give people addictions and like make them feel really bad about themselves and like drink things that like slowly kill them from the inside. I think that politicians generally do feel a general sense of like duty of care to their citizens, and I don't think that like they are likely to enact this policy in this particular way. But also, I know there are like a series of checks and balances that would mean that if the government did it in this particular way, they would just like get super owned by like a royal commission, or they'll probably get like sued into oblivion for enacting a policy that like causes people to be super addicted in the same way that say big tobacco was sued for like getting people addicted to cigarettes. But the third thing to say is this is a really stupid policy electorally. This like the response to this actually just lies in Meg's own analysis, in that people really dislike drug addicts. If the government creates more of them, they probably won't vote for them because it means that people are less safe when they go out at night because more people are alcoholic. But secondly, they just lose the religious vote. Most countries in the world have huge religious populations who are either generally very in favor of just total abstinence from alcohol, or who would advocate for strict prohibitions, or view the overconsumption of alcohol or addiction as things that are really immoral. This is likely to be a super decisive electoral issue in most countries where the religious vote is able to enact their massive lobbying power against the government. Like, why the fuck would you do that? Why would you like go against the Bible, and why would you hurt all these people? But thirdly, we tell you that just like most people like generally have quite measured views on alcohol, or like increasingly, especially a lot of young people are just like getting more and more invested in like the sober curious movement. Neg then says that no, the government is going to do this strategically so people won't notice. I think, but then like the mechanism they give is like they'll provide people with tax cuts. Firstly, it's unclear why the general electorate ever connects those tax cuts to like the massively dumped price of alcohol. Because presumably for this policy to work, right, you have to dump the price of alcohol so significantly that it's like buying like cigarettes in Berlin is like 50 cents a pop. Like, I think people are going to notice that alcohol is a lot cheaper. I think the average intelligent, like the average voter is not stupid and understands how addiction is caused insofar as you consume an addictive substance and then you experience the result. I think that when those addictive substances are easier to get, the average person just literally will connect in their head like, the government is doing this. Also, if the impact that like Neg wants to claim, which is just like the industry gets so powerful and provides so much money, people will like notice that a bunch of people are suddenly employed in alcohol manufacturing, or that like vineyards are a new like national symbol because they're growing so much wine, and probably like cotton onto it. And so if people hate addicts as much as this negative team tells you they do, the government probably isn't going to do this because there are a series of electoral services, which means that like or electoral reasons, that means that this is particularly bad. The second thing that I want to respond to then is some of like the material on how they say that having like more competition is the thing that like keeps alcohol prices like sufficiently high, and the government like circumvent that will allow it to drop it. The first thing to say is that like competition is the thing that drives prices down because firms compete on price. Like a really good way to capture markets is to like cut costs in your production and like drop your prices, which is what makes alcohol more accessible. But secondly, if the government has a monopoly on alcohol, it's unclear why they would necessarily want to drop the prices. Presumably, if there is no alternative person to go to access to something cheaper, you can just like set the prices however you would like. That is generally why services from monopolies cost more, and people criticize them for being inefficient and overpriced because there is no check and balance in the market to keep the price low. But finally, I think that like if you're maximizing for costs, like and trying to do things as cheaply as possible and sell things as cheaply as possible, I think a lot of the harms that we hear about at first negative probably occur where drinking no longer is seen as something that is like a good classy thing to do because it's like the signaling effect of something being expensive and therefore ooh la la and cool like just literally doesn't exist. But also the bottles are probably really ugly, like they're probably marketed in ways that are particularly bad. So I think that like after all of that, the government does not want to transform the population into drug addicts. Other response that I just thought of, like also when people are addicted to things, they're generally very unproductive, they're generally quite bad employees, they're generally quite bad workers. That's probably bad for the market at large. So big business probably probably is also going to be very opposed to this policy, because if you transform their workers into addicts, they just direct people like produce things for them. Alcohol seems like a particularly unrestricted thing. The only push they're saying for this negative team is that people start to drink alcohols in ways that are less enjoyable. But I think the assumption under this argument is that like, people like drinking good ways under status quo. And I think this is empirically untrue. I think that oftentimes people drink because like they have bad things in their lives to cope with, and they drink because they're sad, they drink because they're stressed, and it's the most accessible thing like that they can access. Or I think that people drink because like maybe they feel like socially pressured to, because all of their friends are doing it, so they want to as well. I think that very, very few people like ingesting substances that change how they perceive reality, that warp their ability to make good decisions, that give them extreme anxiety the next day. So I think that reducing the accessibility of that is really, really good. But I think that it's also like generally quite unresponsive to a lot of our case, which is essentially just saying that like consuming alcohol in and of itself is like a net social negative. I think that it's really important, like in this debate, to assume the government is just probably going to be a good actor. The final thing I'm going to do in this speech is just explain why more people are going to access the support services that Jade proves to you will exist. I think the first thing to do is when you tip the balance between having, like, tip the balance between support being the thing that is more accessible than the thing that is causing your addiction, you're just more likely to use it. That is to say that when the financial burden of your addiction is very, very great, and the advertising around support services, and just like the physical proximity, because there's like more of them, like changes, you're probably going to access it. But I think the second thing to say is that the government now has like the ability to make marketing like really, really explicitly detailed. And a lot of people when they drink alcohol, like while they conceptually understand the harms, they're like, something to do with my friends. If the government is like manufacturing everything, they can do things like put a big photo of a person with like stomach cancer on there, or like similar to how cigarettes are packaged. So when people go to make the choice to buy alcohol, they can look at like the really like confronting image on the front and probably put it back in the same way. That's why a lot of people like might conceptually be like, nicotine, cool, but then they see like someone's eyes being chopped out on the package and they don't buy it. I think that's persuasive. I think at the end of this speech, you should know that the government does not want its population to be addicted to drugs. That is stupid and counterintuitive. They do want to help people. They do want to solve the public health crisis that Jade told you about to no response from Neg, and that people will drink alcohol better ways under our side.
Firstly, on why governments want people to get drunk. Secondly, on why people want to get drunk. And thirdly, why the way in which people get drunk is far, far worse on side effects. I just want to clear up what the thing we're talking about actually is, and what the thing we think, like the way in which governments will act as a result of this motion. We explained at Mica that governments want votes first and foremost, and whilst Affirmative might posit or gesture at politicians wanting the safety and benefit and like well-being of their people, that might be nice, but obviously the most proximate interest to these politicians is to get re-elected. And what we explain is that governments wanting re-election will leverage things like, giving people income tax cuts, or lowering prices of alcohol, which is something that people broadly like, as people like to drink alcohol, people would prefer it to be less expensive. And the reason why governments doing this is so important is because they require alcohol as a source of income in order to bankroll those tax cuts, which is particularly important. So why do governments necessarily want this, and why would they do this over things like healthcare? We explain that governments, firstly, as I already mentioned, want things like re-election, and the way in which they'll do that is by giving people, giving people tax cuts and all that sort of stuff. So, what does that mean that governments are likely to do in order to get people to drink more often? The first reason is just that they aren't doing things like countervailing measures, so countervailing narratives about why alcohol consumption is bad. But secondly, we explain that though alcohol just will be cheaper, because governments are able to collect more money because alcohol companies aren't taking a cut of that profit anymore, which means that governments are able to sell this alcohol for cheaper. Affirmative's only mechanization, which is generous because it's an example, is to explain that Sweden does this and it's fine. First response is that this is not a mechanism, this is just an example. But secondly, Sweden is a heavily taxed state, which means they have other sources of government revenue in order to do things like other things like healthcare and tax cuts and all that sort of stuff. And we explained that in most states in which governments don't have a huge source of revenue, this does become a huge source of revenue in order for governments to do things like tax cuts and other politically popular policies and other politically popular policies, which means that the way in which they are going to bankroll these policies is to get people to drink as much as possible. The second thing I'll explain is why people don't care about alcoholism. And the main response is just to say that this is a very individualized problem, which means that people don't perceive it as being a problem to them. Because firstly, they have a positivity bias, because they don't believe that they are the ones that are going to fall victim to alcoholism, or conversely, they don't feel like they are going to be the ones that are harmed by the effects of drunk people on the street. But secondly, they just have a survivorship bias because at the point at which you see some people drinking alcohol, or maybe a lot of your friends drinking alcohol, but they're not necessarily turning into alcoholics, they probably don't believe that this issue is that widespread. But thirdly, they do just think that alcoholics are inferior people and therefore aren't worth saving. Lilah says that, but it's good now because alcoholics are paying that burden off on themselves and therefore we're more willing to help them. But the problem with this argument is that that is the status quo, because if you believe now that alcohol is taxed to a substantial degree, which in most Western states it is, you must believe then that this is a symmetric idea, right? Like people would already be perceiving alcoholics as paying off their hospital bills or public healthcare bills. And this doesn't happen in the status quo, so I'm not actually given a reason as to explain why the money that governments are using is actually going to healthcare. So what do these people actually care about there? And we explain to you that the thing that people do care about is just governments lowering their taxes. And that's because firstly, that just gives them more disposable income, which is probably something that people deem is really valuable to them. But secondly, and more importantly, this is a direct and certain benefit to them. So if you believe my explanation earlier, which is that the harms of alcoholism are rather dubious and nebulous to people, and people don't believe that they are certainly going to be victims of it, what you should believe is that they certainly are the beneficiaries of things like tax cuts, which means then they are not likely to, things like healthcare prioritized as what Affirmative is propping, healthcare that is prioritized towards alcohol prevention and alcohol treatment. They also don't believe that that is a benefit that they reap, which means that the benefit that they actually care about is something that is far more direct and far more certain to them, which we explain as tax cuts, which means then that the electoral incentives of these people is for governments to give them these things, and we explain to you that the way in which governments are going to give people these things, is by making people more drunk and that sort of stuff. They also give this example of in religious states, why would governments do this alcoholism? Why would governments have incentive to keep people drinking alcohol as a source of revenue? And I would just posit that in religious states or governments where the majority of the population is religious, they probably just wouldn't nationalize the industry in the first place. So this doesn't really work. So the second thing I just want to explain is that why is it the case? I'll give you some other reasons as to why governments don't care if people get drunk. And the first reason is that they can just offset it with the benefits, as I've already explained before. So maybe I've already explained to you that people care more about their tax cuts and those sort of things. So if it is the case that people might be concerned about alcoholism or the rise of the harms of alcoholism, governments are very easily able to just justify that and say, hey, this gives you those tax cuts, those things that you care so much about, which means that, and as I've already explained to you, voters care more about that. So this is, I guess, a trade-off that voters are willing to make. But secondly, governments are just able to dodge accountability by saying things like, the alcohol industry is safer, the alcohol industry, the alcohol is safer and all that, and higher quality if the government does it. But thirdly, the harms of alcoholism are rather private. So if you didn't, on top of what I already said before about the harms of alcoholism being, I guess, rather nebulous and speculative, we explained to you that the harms of alcoholism are extremely private. So for instance, they occur in the home, things like, partner abuse and parental neglect, things like hiding hangovers or and those sort of things. Those harms of alcohol are really private, so it's unclear to me that there is going to be huge public support in order to combat this hugely prevalent issue, when most of the harms of alcoholism do occur within the confines of the house. Additionally, as Mica says, governments can just do things like have more police officers to control riots and control all those problems, which means that the control all those problems, which means that the harms of alcohol aren't actually that visible inside of them, which means that there isn't that much of an impetus to control them. The next thing I want to add in this debate, and it's kind of new, is just that in illiberal states or in illiberal democracies, this problem becomes particularly bad because these governments do not have any electoral incentives or any electoral accountabilities, which means that they are just free to collect a bunch of revenue from these people to do things what they want with them, whether that be military or other policies. And that's particularly bad. And sure, we agree that, as Affirmative pointed out, that it does reduce productivity and it is bad for the market. But obviously these governments are relatively intelligent, so they probably wouldn't be getting everyone so drunk that the society ceases to function. But it is just true that in the liberal sense, when they do not have democratic accountability mechanisms, that they are more able to just do things like get people to drink more, as in order to collect that revenue. What is the impact of all of that then? The impact of all of that is just that more people are drinking at the point at which alcohol is cheaper, and governments are able to get away with this because they leverage giving people what they want at the cost of which is tax cuts and other beneficial policies, and they and that is a trade-off that people are willing to make in their minds because they don't believe that alcoholism is as big of a problem to them in comparison to a sure and guaranteed benefit to them, which is an extra like $100 a week or $100 a month because of those tax cuts. The last thing I want to talk about in this speech then is just the issue of culture and how alcohol consumption is worse. Because we explained that governments, because they want efficiency and economies of scale, will only do like 3 types of alcohol. It will be like taste really shit and all that sort of stuff. And given at the point at which this debate changes, or governments do nationalize these industries, the same set of people are still drinking, which means that people no longer are able to see alcohol as something that brings them joy and a social activity, but now alcohol is seen as solely a utile drug because there isn't that diversity, there isn't that, enjoyment. You aren't able to glean enjoyment from a glass of champagne or whatever, which means you're only able to see alcohol as utility. And at the point at which you only see alcohol as utility, that breeds reliance on that utility, which means people are more likely to drink alcohol in worse ways, quite negative.
I'm going to explain 3 things in speech. Firstly, why government will not drop prices. Second of all, why does it help the addiction problem? Finally, I will weigh why this increase of absolute government revenue is just something that is very important, even take their best case scenario that goes to funding tax cuts or etc. So anyways, why government will not drop prices? I think the silly claim from this side Affirmative assume that the government only care about re-election, and the government is ruled by a single party that does not have parliament, does not have legislative policies. I think it's very unclear that why the government only cares about re-election. We're saying there are lots of counter narrative and counter issues that the government probably care about, especially in a cohesive parliament. For example, people, they care about economic productivity and efficiency of the people. Obviously, do not want their entire economy to dysfunctional and to the entire economy to be addicted. Second of all, addiction directly causes people to be singing on the street, rotting on the street, like the British in the UK, and obviously it's visibly ugly and it's visibly unpopular. I think third of all, it's just you have lots of domestic violence that is caused by alcohol, drug addiction, etc. I think these women are likely to vote against your policy. So even though taking their best case scenario, the government do care about re-election, I think it's very unclear that why the government will drop the prices. And I think second of all is that they're just completely unresponsive to our argument. Basically, their only response is that society is probably not that religious. Bro, look at the demographic composition. There are lots of Muslims and there are lots of Christians. They're just actively against alcohol. And second of all, there are lots of also lots of old people who are pretty conservative, and there are probably lots of rich people who are probably quite judgy about drinking and huge consumption. So I think these people are likely to vote against this policy. I think the final response to this argument is that they talk about how because this satisfies the proximate interests of people, and people were likely to vote for the government, so people will do that. And it's very unclear to me why people will just look at the beer prices every day and suddenly be like, oh, this beer price dropped, I'm gonna vote for the government. It's very unlikely that people will make this kind of decision. And I think even though there are punters who make this decision, they're going to be extreme case scenario, they're probably going to vote for this silly government anyways, because if the silly government wants to drop the prices. So it's just very unclear to me why only Chow assumed that he will vote for a government that will decrease the price of
likely to do the same irrational decision as he did. That's the reason why the false argument of dropping prices are cancelled. I just want to have an additional mechanism, is that if the government actually are so proxy maximizing, and which is their second mechanism, obviously you just increase the single price of a single item. It is way easier than increasing the quantity of people drinking, because if you increase the single price of a single item, you don't have such a huge cost, comparatively speaking, to dropping the prices, because you still have a fixed amount of the cost. And obviously this is something that is so financially unintuitive. It's something economically doesn't make sense to me, right? And second of all, I just don't understand why, in the entire earth, just name one single monopoly that I'm gonna get a monopoly of some certain resources and then drop the prices. Like, people will use monopoly obviously to maximize the profit and increase per item price, because it's the cheapest way, and the easiest way you can get maximized return. Unclear why the increased quantity of side negative is economics intuitions. Second of all, I will talk about why this money are likely to go into healthcare. First of all, I think you obviously, this is something that Lilah said, they didn't respond, so I probably just have to restate it again. Okay, so first of all, you remove the previous taxpayer ego. Don't waste my money, don't waste my taxes, fixing this problem, previous problem. They right now probably just don't give a shit, because obviously they know that they are the profit revenues of the direct alcoholics, so they probably just do not give a shit of how these profits are being used. And obviously they will be probably very happy if you can solve the problem of drug, alcoholics, or just walking in the town hall and be like, I'm gonna kill you. Yeah, okay. And I think second of all, even if this money doesn't go to healthcare, which is their worst case scenario, they say, oh, but obviously it will fund tax cut. I'm gonna question this feasibility and the likelihood of this argument later. But first of all, even taking their best case scenario, this money does go to tax cut. I think this is an absolute benefit, because previously those money go to the private individuals who own those alcohol oligarchs. Previously this money wasted fancy water, fancy drinking bottles, fancy advertisement, hiring a celebrity to be representing you alcoholic brand. We will posit to you, we've already proven to you that government are pretty shit at marketing. Government probably do not have fancy branding, and they probably just do not have a department to spend money on the marketing of the alcohol. If they are, as well side negative said that, so profit maximizing, obviously they would not spend so much time on marketing. So the waste of money that previously goes to the marketing right now goes back into tax cut. So if there is a tax of the citizens and everybody have more purchasing power in the economy, I think this is something that is massively beneficial for the individual. This is something that is maximizing the productivity of the economy, because you have a reoccurring financial insert back to the economy. And that's to say, even if their best case scenario, they're silly counterfactual, we still win this debate, because we're actually taking the money from rich individuals to these people to have a tax cut. We're taking away these monies wasted on marketing process, go back into the healthcare. Second of all, why is it likely to go to the healthcare? First of all, because I just don't want to explain it again. Addiction is a serious problem, people hate it. And obviously you do not want to send people into prison, and obviously you want to improve the quality of life of the rehabilitation center. I think second of all, it's just when you're in parliament, you're discussing these kind of scenarios, you raise the concerns, you said harms and benefits. And third of all, right now activist groups are also more likely to just directly campaign against government, because they are right now have a justification to say, oh, and also because you remove the private companies' lobbying power. So right now activist groups, if they're advocating for rehabilitation center, it is much more easier for them to activate against it, because it's just you remove a private, a separate lobbying group, and it's just much more easier and much more smoother, because you do not have the obstacles and you're not being hindered and impeded on their side. And I think finally it's just weighing against why this is so important, because I think these people are incredibly vulnerable and they probably do not have alternative in the current status quo. I think you can massively increase, even though a benefit is marginal, even though they just probably have a little bit more healthcare fund, they probably have a little bit more addiction center. Probably it's just when you go into the retail shop, when you go into the bottle shop, there are more signs and posters about, oh, you probably do not do underage drinking. There are lots of more discouraged signs. We are saying this is still a massive, even though it seems marginal, but aggregately added up in society, this is still something that is very good. It is that when you were a teenager, when you're feeling rebellious and you walk into the shop, you're like, what the fuck? That's $50, and you just walk out of the shop. That is time you didn't start drinking and abusing alcohol when you were incredibly sad. You do not develop the habit at the very beginning because of the deterrence power of the high price, and that is the reason why this is so important. And I think only then run the argument about how recreational drinking is probably pretty good. If people are able to access lots of drinking, it's probably a beneficial thing. if they want to argue that recreational drinking is probably good, I think recreational drinking is symmetric on both sides. The amount of people that consume it for social settings are probably still similar the same. But I think the delta of this debate is that whether or not you will start addiction and whether or not you're going to give this benefit and give this profits hugely to the government. Finally, I would just weigh this argument incredibly highly of that why increased government revenue is something that is very important in this debate. First of all, you have absolute certainty. You just absolutely increase the profit revenue. I think the analogy here is that Norway have a Nordic style of their welfare fund, so they have nationalized of their natural resources, so that all the natural resources revenue go directly back to their sovereign wealth fund. Comparatively speaking to Australia, who have private ownership of their mining resources, etc., so the profit do not directly go back to the citizens. That is the same. Right now, we have a directness of the benefit directly exerted back to the citizens under over model. We're saying alcohol is something that is inherently abusing people's mentality. Obviously, after abuse, those benefits should trickle back into the economy, should trickle back into the individual, instead of trickling back into the pocket of a few alcohol oligarchs that cite a negative, never try to engage with. And third of all, we just maximize the utility and maximize the efficient use of those financial revenues and financial resources. We didn't use it like massive campaigning, massive lobbying for lower regulations for private alcohol companies, and obviously that is something that's pretty good. So for others, just not project code.